actually going to talk generally about a couple of research things that I find really exciting in the field of bee cognition, so not just my own research. And I hope that by the end of all of this, you can understand that looking at the behavior of bees can teach us a lot about how they see the world, and we can appreciate the intelligence of the animal, which should not be too hard since you're all here in the Beekeepers Club and you all obviously love bees. Hopefully I will help you, fall a little bit more in love with this beautiful animal. So this, what you're looking at, is where all the magic happens. So it's not a purple croissant, it's actually a CT scan of the bee brain. And it looks, quite big on the screen, but if you think about it, if you imagine the size of a bee's head, so this brain is actually the size of a sesame seed. And when you think about something that small, you kind of wonder how much, or how much can this like small brain be capable of? Surely with a brain this small, they would only be able to do really simple things, or maybe even respond to different events based on instincts or in a robotic way. So as humans, we often like to think of insects kind of like drones or unconscious robots. This happens a lot in movies, and we think that they feel no pain and have no thoughts. And this was and is still how a lot of people think about insect brains and how they work. And actually, over 100 years ago, it was widely assumed that color vision was not possible in the bee brain because they don't have the brain power for it. The brain is too small. And it was thought that only our superior mammalian brains, our big brains, can appreciate the beauty of colors in nature. So it wasn't actually until 1914, so this is Nobel laureate Carl von Frisch. He was the first person to definitively prove that bees could actually see in color. This makes bees actually the second animal to be proven to have color vision, the first being goldfish. So what you see on the right here is his very famous landmark experiment. It's actually just a very simple experiment where he put sugar water on the blue square, and the bees would land on the square, and they would remember that blue means food. And then over time, you have all of these bees just going straight to the blue, ignoring all the other squares that were achromatics. They had no color, but they varied in brightness. So this quite obviously shows that the bees could actually learn the color blue, and that they weren't actually relying on the brightness of the color, which was the theory at the time. Everyone thought that bees could not see color. They were just instead seeing the brightness of the petals. And this, was quite controversial, and also really important because it proved, well, it was the starting point at which people started to think, maybe there's more to the brain. They can process color. Maybe they can do a whole lot more, even though the brain is so small. So this very smart looking man, he is Auguste Forel. So he made another very interesting observation about bees. So Forel, he really liked to have marmalade on his toast. So maybe some of you can relate to that. He would enjoy his breakfast on his front porch every morning. And he found that he would get, bees would be visiting him every morning, trying to get a bit of that marmalade. And he found that even on days when he didn't bring marmalade, maybe he was having something else, the bees would still be visiting him at the exact same place and the exact same time. So this was actually one of the first recorded observations of another thing that bees can do. They can learn to visit a specific place at a specific time, something that we now call time memory. And in nature, this is very useful for bees because they can remember, the best times in the day to visit different flowers or food sources. So this next gentleman is Dr. Max Renner. So he took this concept of time memory one step further. So he wondered, how do bees actually keep track of the time? How are they learning the different times in the day? Are they using an internal clock like the circadian rhythm that humans have? And Dr. Renner, he was actually a student of Carl von Frisch, the Nobel laureate from earlier. Uh, and von Frisch, he was interested in the same question. He had a theory that bees did actually have an internal clock similar to humans, and that they could actually, in theory, experience something like jet lag if you took them to a different time zone. And so to test this, he actually sent one of his students to the US on an ocean liner. But very sadly, that turned out to be a huge fail because that student, he didn't know, but he got very seasick and he just was too unwell to actually monitor the beehives. So he didn't get any data at all. And actually, 20 years later, Renner decided to give this another go. But this time he would, instead of going on a boat, he would take his bees on a plane. So this is a picture of Dr. Renner listening to his beehive, which is in his hand carry, so checking if they're okay. Luckily for him, it was 1955, and it wasn't yet a terrorist act to bring beehive onto a plane. Well, Renner had a few problems anyway. So firstly, he had to, convince the staff not to put his bees in the cargo hold. Obviously, that was too cold; they would just freeze to death. Once he convinced them to do that, back then they had, very rigorous pesticide spraying of the cabin to make sure there weren't any pests in the cabin. Obviously, that would kill the bees as well. So he actually threatened the staff. He said, please don't spray pesticides. If you do, I will release all my bees into the cabin, and then you'll have a lot of trouble. So the staff, they took him quite seriously and decided to skip the pesticides this time. So eventually, Renner and his bees safely arrived to Paris. And back in the US, he trained his bees to come out and look for food specifically at 8:30 p.m. And when he arrived at Paris, he waited to see what time the bees would come out. And he found that they came out at 3:30 local time instead of 8:30 local time, which was 5 hours earlier. The time difference between the US and Paris, which he flew to, was 5 hours. And this showed that the bees did get jet lag. So they were running on Paris time. They weren't actually relying on any celestial cues, or they weren't looking at the location of the sun or some sort of magnetic signal. They were using an internal clock, and that's why they also got jet lagged as well. From this crazy experiment, he concluded that the bees have a very similar circadian rhythm, so internal clock, similar to humans, and that this time sense helps them to prepare for the sunrise and sunset. And it helps them make the most of the daylight to visit the flowers. So fast forward to now, science has obviously advanced a lot. We don't have to rely on just watching and observing the bees. We now have developed modern training methods to actually train the bees to do more complicated experiments. So at this point, bees are actually the poster child They're a well-established model for insect vision and cognition, which means they are our little gateway into the world of insects. Um, and this is because of a few reasons. Firstly, they're very cute and charismatic, so that helps. But there are three main reasons why they are the perfect study species, at least to me. And I'm not biased at all. Uh, firstly, we know them very well. We have a very long relationship with keeping bees, and it dates back to as far as ancient Egyptian times. You can see here some cool hieroglyphs of bees. Maybe if you're interested, you can try and learn them in your spare time. Uh, Back then, they would they would keep bees in woven baskets covered in clay, and that was the beehive. So even back then, they had relatively, for that time, advanced beekeeping techniques. And as you all know, nowadays we have much more modernized and refined beekeeping to the point where it's possible to have research hives next to the lab, and we can easily access them for experiments. Secondly, the lifestyle of a worker bee means that they have to have really strong cognitive abilities. They need to be able to find food successfully and navigate in really complicated environments. They need to find these flowers amongst many different objects in the environment. They need to learn remember the color, the shape, and the smell of the different flowers. They need to learn how to get back to the flowers. Once they go back home, they need to remember how did I go to this flower in the first place? And to give you a bit of an idea, a bee can learn a new color in about half an hour, uh, which is really, really fast. They can learn a new pattern in about half a day, and they can learn a new route to a food source in about 3 to 4 visits. Yeah, I don't know about you, but I still have to use my GPS for very Google Maps for very simple things. But the bee can learn a new route in 3 to 4 visits, so that's very impressive. So not only can they learn a lot, they can learn things really, really fast. And thirdly, which to me, I think is the most important aspect, is that worker bees, they're collecting food for the hive and not just for themselves to eat, which means that they can make many, many visits to a food source, even if they aren't hungry themselves. This makes them one of the best animals to train because perhaps you have a dog and you're teaching the dog new tricks, but once the dog stops being hungry, you've given him or her a few biscuits, and she's full, doesn't want any more food. She'll just go to the corner and have a nap. But bees, they'll keep coming because they're foraging food for the hive. And not only can you train them for the entire day, you can also, they'll also bring their friends to come as well. They're dancing in the hive, they'll bring the friends. So you have a whole colony of workers that will almost endlessly learn a task as long as you exchange for food. So all of this, in summary, means that bees are very easy to keep, they're very smart, and you can train them very, very quickly. So yeah, they're really the ideal model species for animal cognition. So since they're so smart, what can you actually teach them to do? Well, bees are really good at associative learning, which means you can teach them to learn associations between two things, uh, or a relationship between two things. This is one of my experiments. So you can see here the bee is having a very good time in the tunnel. I call this the bee disco tunnel. Um, I can make it flash. and play music is very entertaining. But the purpose of this tunnel is to actually train bees to associate a color, for example, blue, with a shape. And to train a bee, it's actually relatively easy. So all you need is some sugar water. And once you give a bee a taste of this sugar water, she will come and visit you um, instead of going to the flowers. So you could try this out if you're bored one day. Once you have the attention of the bee, you can train her with little baby steps, just like any animal, by giving her little drops of sugar water until she eventually, so for this tunnel, for example, I would put drops of sugar water until she eventually moves through the tunnel. And then at the very end, I'll just put one drop at the very end of the tunnel, and she would have learned to go straight through the tunnel to reach the reward at the end. This is an example of a fully trained bee. So here the bee is flying. I hope the video is working, by the way. Yeah, the bee is flying into the tunnel. Then I give it a color of light, so blue. Then the bee flies out. It flies into another chamber where it has to make a decision. And in this case, blue is associated with square. So the bee, being really smart, she'll fly straight to the square. Obviously, this will take a lot of training to do. So it usually takes me about half a day. If the bee is not cooperative, maybe it'll take the whole day to actually get them to do something like this. So once the bee can, with this associative learning, you can actually teach them to do even more interesting things. For example, you can train the bees to solve a maze, and you can get them to do this by just very, very simple rules. For example, here the green was trained to associate a green mark with food. So every time the bee would see green, they would fly towards it to find food. Eventually, you can put the green mark inside the maze. The bee will keep following the green until eventually you can put the green at the very end of the maze, and the bee will just keep following the green until it reaches the end and finds the food. So here is a little video. You can see the bee quite easily following the green mark. And then at the end, would give them some food reward for all their hard work. It can get a lot more complicated. So here, the bee isn't just following a green mark, but they have to use an abstract signpost of two colors. So blue here means to go to the right, and yellow means go to the left. So now we're getting into pretty sophisticated rule learning. So here the bee is learning that the color rule, and it will help them decide whether to go left or right. Actually, the bees, it'll take them some time to actually learn the rule, but once they do, they can perform this task just as easily as the other task. So bees are really good at learning colors, but they're also really good at learning really complicated shapes and patterns. As beekeepers, I'm sure one of the things you've always wondered is, can my bee recognize me? Well, so bees can learn human faces when they're trained to. It doesn't mean that they will unless they have a good reason for it. So just make sure you don't piss off your bees. Uh, so here, the bees were actually trained to this picture bee here, this face, and after they had learned that this face means food, the experimenters here, they gave them some comparisons. So on the right here, so the first comparison was the face they had learned, and they would compare it with a smiley face. Can bees tell the difference between a human face and a smiley face? It's quite a simple task, so yes, they can. In fact, they can do it really, really well at nearly 90% accuracy. But then we get to the more trickier parts where we're comparing the face with another human face. And actually, this is quite tough because it's it's a similar facial structure, similar facial layout. You have eyes, nose, mouth. But um, keep in mind that bees, their vision also isn't as good as ours in terms of spatial vision. But regardless, it turns out they're actually also really good at learning this, and 80% accuracy is really high um, for bee cognition. So clearly, the bees can actually, if they're trained, they can learn human faces. So they have the mental capacity to do this. Whether or not they're actually learning your faces, I guess it depends how you treat your bees. Uh, so another skill that bees can do is observational learning. So for example, bumblebees, they have an ability to learn and pick up new skills from their fellow workers. So I don't know if any of you are soccer fans, but yes, there are people who have trained bees to play soccer. Here, the researchers on the left here, they were training the bees to move the yellow circle into, the yellow ball, sorry, into the yellow circle. And if they did that, they got a reward. But how did they do this? So firstly, they would train the bees with a fake bee. So a fake bee on a stick. Play video. So we have this bumblebee, and she's watching very carefully. This fake bee pushing the ball into the circle, and when it gets near the ball, it would get a sugar water reward. From this, the bee starts thinking, "Hey, there's something's going on," and she gives it a go herself. Eventually, you can see her carefully rolling the ball into the circle. And once you have one bee who can do this, you don't need a fake bee anymore. So that bee can actually show another bee how to do the same thing. And this video just shows that the bees can very efficiently solve the task by choosing the closest ball to the circle. So not only have they learned the task, but they can efficiently solve the task based on the conditions at hand. So one of the most interesting things about this is that the bees learned the best when there was a social demonstration compared to when they were taught with a fake bee. And since the bumblebee can very easily learn these skills from watching each other, this can lead to the skill being transferred to the majority of workers in the hive. And this is what we call cultural transmission. So it's the skill transfer, the ability to pass down a skill for generations and keep it within the population, or in this case, the hive. This is something that was thought to require a sophisticated brain. And here is another example of this idea of cultural transmission. So here, one bee was taught to pull the string, and in the middle of the blue disc is a sugar water reward. So here you can see the bee pulling the string until eventually can get it. So this behavior is really interesting because it's not something that they would encounter in natural environment. But in this case, only one bee was taught to do this. And then they would monitor this one bee for 150 visits to the disk. And they found that after 150 visits, half of the hive, the research hive, could actually do this task as well. So this skill was transferred to the majority of workers in that hive, keeping in mind that bumblebee hives are much smaller than honeybee hives. And this is a research hive with even small. Actually, there were only 50 bumblebees in this research hive. So about 25 bees picked up the skill after one bee was seeded into the colony. Yeah, this transmission of learning between individual bees allows for new skills to be passed on and kept for long periods of time. Again, this is something that was previously seen only in birds and mammals. So that will be the ongoing trend for this whole presentation. And then finally, one of the most exciting things to me in bee cognition is the beautiful recent work on number sense. It turns out that bees are pretty good with numbers. They can easily count up to 4. Um, they can push up to 5 and 6 if they tried really hard. But the problem is that the bees have quite bad memory. So they can easily remember up to 4 objects, but anything pushing past that, they start having a lot of trouble with. So not only can bees count, but they can actually also understand really abstract ideas like the concept of zero. And this is something that young human children actually struggle with learning. And the basic idea is that zero is not just nothing, but it's also a number and it has a location on the number line. So in this work, the bees were actually trained. So they first taught this rule to always choose the smaller number. So for example, if they were shown 2 dots versus 3 dots, they would be taught to land on 2. 2 is the correct choice. If they were shown 4 versus 2, then 2 is the correct choice. And then once they had learned this rule, then they were given a real test. So they were shown a blank picture versus a number. And I guess you guys can think about what you might think the bees would choose in this case. They were trained to choose the smaller number, and here they're shown a blank picture and then another number, for example, 2. Well, actually, the bees chose the blank picture most of the time. And this is pretty surprising because I would have thought that the bees would pick 2, but they've been trained to count dots. So I would have thought that they'll just ignore the blank picture, but actually they seem to be processing the blank picture as a 0, as no number, and 0 is less than 2. In fact, when the difference between 0 and the other number is larger, for example, 0 versus 6, they choose 0 even more often. So the actual difference in magnitude, so the distance, the number distance, affects how they process the problem. At this point, only primates like chimpanzees were shown to have a concept of 0. So the fact that a tiny insect brain can not only count, but have this abstract concept is really, really impressive, actually. So all of these behavioral studies that I've talked about today, They show us that bees are really good at learning and they can solve difficult tasks that they come across in the wild. But the next question is, how do they behave in natural conditions? Because no, it's really great that we know the full potential of the bee brain, but when they're really highly trained, but this must be quite different to how bees actually behave in the wild. For example, in terms of numbers, one example is sure bees can count. They have a concept of zero. They're really smart. But how important are numbers to bees in natural conditions? Do bees actually look for flower patches with more flowers versus less flowers, or do they not really care too much? This is another study that I was very lucky to be involved in. Um, and we tried to test this exact idea. We trained bees to first learn that a yellow dot was an artificial flower. And whenever they saw or landed on the yellow dot, it means they got some food. And once they had learned this association, we then gave them some number comparisons. So on the right is just a whole bunch of different comparisons that we showed to them. For example, 1 versus 5. Do they pick the larger number of artificial flowers, or do they not really care how many there are as long as they just see a flower? What we found was that bees actually they did prefer the larger number only when there was a comparison between 1 and a larger number. So they'd always choose the larger number between 1 and 5 or 1 and 4. But when it was a comparison involving numbers that were larger than 1, so 3 versus 6 or 4 versus 20, they didn't really seem to care. So to me, this means that bees, they're trying to avoid looking for patches with very little flowers, so just one flower. But once they find a patch that has a few flowers, they don't really mind how many flowers are in that patch. Numbers aren't the only thing that could be important to bees in a natural context. So time is another resource that could be important in the decision making of bees. This is actually one of my main focuses for my PhD, looking at how important time is to bees when they make decisions. I spoke a lot about time before, but actually, we know that time is important to bees because of their time memory, but not much is known about whether they can actually keep track of really short durations of time. We have some clues of this in their natural behaviors. For example, bees communicate their location and quality of the food with a waggle dance. And one part of the dance, which is called the waggle run, which is when they're shaking vigorously from side to side in the middle here, uh, it indicates the distance, it codes the distance of a food source, and it tells the other bees how far they need to fly. And this is based on the duration of that waggle run. So in order to decode this message, the other bees need to actually time or have a sense of knowing how long the other bee has been doing this waggle run for in order to themselves fly and find exactly where that food is. So in this case, bees seem to have a time sense at this very short time scale when watching the dance of other bees, but we don't know if time is important to them in other contexts, like when they're outside the hive looking for food. And that was actually one of my main interests. So right now, this is what I'm working on right now. So I'm actually trying to test this by seeing if I can train bees to use time information to make decisions about food. Here, instead of another bee doing the vibrating, it will be me using a speaker underneath a tunnel. So I will be vibrating the bees for different amounts of time to see if they can learn to match it with a color. For example, a 3-second duration of vibration might be paired with yellow, while a longer 6 seconds would be paired with blue. So we know that bees can learn colors and patterns really well, but we actually have no idea how they might use time in this kind of context in a foraging condition. So this month and last month, I spent a lot of time vibrating bees on the rooftop. I admit it sometimes does feel quite silly doing this for weeks at a time. You're just up there vibrating bees, but it's all for science. It's an ongoing project, so I don't have the full results yet. But if they could actually learn this, it would show that bees can or are paying attention to time as a source of information. So maybe when they're feeding flowers, they might be thinking of how long it takes for them to handle specific types or species of flowers, or how long they might be thinking how long they're spending foraging at each flower. But it's also possible that they just don't care and ignore time information if it's not that important to them. So clearly, even though we already know a lot about bees, there's still plenty that we still don't know about the bee brain and how they use different types of information. What we do know is that despite their tiny, tiny brains that have only 1 million neurons, and compared to human brains with 100 billion neurons. So that's quite a big difference. They are capable of doing many things that were thought to be only possible in big-brained animals. They can learn rules and relationships between objects. They can memorize locations, shapes, colors. They can adapt to different conditions. So maybe I hope next time you see your bees, whether it be in the beehive or out and about, you can appreciate their cleverness. And it really goes to show that even a tiny brain can accomplish really big things. Yeah, that's actually all I have for today. So I hope I didn't overload your brains, but
Leslie, thank you very much. That's absolutely fascinating. And I wonder if anyone's got any questions, either putting them in the chat or if you say them, you will appear on the screen.
Thanks, quick question from Krista for Leslie. Can you hear me,
yeah.
Leslie?
Yes, I can hear you.
So you mentioned that bees have the mental capacity to learn faces. How long did it take for the bees to learn those faces that you showed us?
Yeah, so basically for most of these experiments, it takes us half a day to do most of the things that I talked about today. And usually we need to use a punishment and reward. So to learn really difficult tasks, I would classify this as difficult. The very slight differences between faces from a bee's perspective, of course. Yeah. So
how do you punish a bee?
So no, we don't electrocute them. We're not barbarians. We give them a bitter quinine solution, so it just tastes bitter to them. They just don't like it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Leslie, I have a question too. And do you know how long can they actually remember things? And in particular, you were suggesting that they can recognize faces. And so potentially they could recognize the beekeeper when they arrive and at the hive. And so that implies that if you treat your bees nicely and you're very gentle at handling the frames, then that might actually help them remain gentle afterwards. And if you are rough with them, now, most beekeepers don't open their hives several times a day. They just open their hives, maybe once a week or, once every 10 days or whatever the thing is. Do you think they can remember that long?
Yes. So in terms of memory, they will forget if they aren't exposed to it. So in psychology, we call this extinction. So, and most of what I talk about in terms of memory is based on extinction. So we stop giving the bee, the information and see how long they still remember. But in the case of, your own bees, since you're constantly seeing them, even if it's like every day or every few days, in theory, they should be able to remember if they're actually learning and they want to remember your face.
Mm. The other question that I have is, can they be trained for smell as well? I mean, you have shown that they can be trained for numbers and colors and...
Yeah, so actually, because they're really good at smelling, so they're actually much better at learning smells. In fact, this is why we have a lot of research. I talked to Barry about this earlier, but there's a lot of research in terms of drug sniffing bees, or even bomb sniffing bees. So you just train bees. I know, right? You can just replace, the dogs, and they're much cheaper and much faster to train. So yeah, you just have to train the bees to specific, smell, and they'll retain that. And even though they have a short lifespan, because they're so easy to train, you can keep training the different bees. So yeah, they're really good at learning smells.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, JP, for those questions. Any other questions?
Yes,
Okay,
Louise.
I'll let you, we'll thank Leslie.
Louise has a question.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
Are we asking a lot of bees if we're migratory beekeepers? It seems that would put a lot of stress on them.
Are we asking them that question?
Or are we asking them to remember a lot more than, say, bees that we have that just in our own?
So yeah, so that's really interesting. The difference between like the cognition between like wild bees and domesticated bees, is that sort of what you're talking about?
No, I'm talking about people who take bees for pollination and that are on the move all the time rather than bees that
Yeah.
in one location.
So bees, because they're so good at learning, their brains are good at learning things really fast. So even though you're taking them to different places, they're actually good enough to learn new flowers or new smells, new locations really quickly. Even if you move a beehive to a different location, they'll feel a bit confused and lost, but they'll quickly learn the specific location of their new home. So that's not, yeah.
Leslie, do you get a sense of whether bees have a long-term memory, or is it always short-term memory?
So bees, that's a really good question. I would say yes, they do have a long-term memory, but it also depends on the species of bees and the lifestyle of that specific species of bees. So bees, they're really good at learning new things and then forgetting it and then picking up new things. So it's the short-term memory is more obvious. But if you expose them to something over a really long time, they would be able to retain it for a long time as well. But that's only assuming you teach them this specific thing for a long time in the first place. And usually, because bees live in a very ever-changing environment, this is usually not the case.
Okay, thank you.
No other questions. I just got one question where you're just looking at field bees who've got a certain type of memory or the certain task that you have to recall. Inside the hive, the young bees that hatch out have got certain duties that they perform. Have you got any thoughts about that type of learning that they might be undertaking to achieve those tasks?
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I personally don't know much about that, but I had a colleague who was working on that, and he mentioned it to me, the idea that perhaps bees as, as larvae might, if you possibly teach them something at that stage, would they be able to remember it when they're adults? Now, I never heard about, something like that. I never heard about that ever again. So maybe it didn't work out, but but it is interesting to think about.
Thank you, Leslie.
There's a comment from Sandra in the chat, Barry.
Is there, okay, can you read it out, please?
Yeah, sure. So Sandra is saying to people about the telling of the bees ritual, that beekeepers, when a beekeeper dies, someone needs to tell the bees the beekeeper has died. What do you think about that, Leslie?
Well,
are you familiar with that ritual?
I've heard about it. I guess it depends on that specific beekeeper more than the bees. If the beekeeper has, if the beekeeper has actually been like interacting with that bee, quite often, then perhaps they would remember. But also, I think normally it doesn't really affect their lives too much in terms of finding food. So in terms of like remembering faces, I feel like they might learn it, but maybe they just don't care because it doesn't affect them too much. Their job is just to find flowers. They'll remember that, but
I get the sense that ritual is one of showing respect to
a
valued source of resource to the family. But no, it's a wonderful story, the telling of the bees. Yes, thank you, Sandra, for that.
Leslie, I have a question. Do you record how old your bees are when you start the training? I mean, what stage are they? Are they how many days old after?
Yeah, so we don't actually record that, but we only train adult worker bees. So generally, there is difference. Well, there should be some difference in terms of mobility between like old bees and young bees, but in terms of cognition, there hasn't been any findings that show there's much cognitive differences between really old and really young adult bees.
I see. Thank you.
Dave and Kez, did you have a question or your hand's gone down?
Hi, yes, it's Kez here. I did have a question, but I kind of don't know how to ask it. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on whether there's a difference in the level of cognition where the bees think as a colony versus the individual bee, learning new things and being able to, function. I don't know if that makes any sense, because obviously like how they manage their population, what they need more of, that sort of stuff. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so it's a really complicated topic, and it's a whole field in itself in terms of how do bees come to a decision in terms of like they need, as a hive, they need to make decisions about where to move, whether they should move or migrate, what is a good location to pick. So I think in terms of that, or I guess in terms of individual bees as well, there's a mix of both kind of like hardwired. I don't really like the word hardwired, but I'll use it anyway. Like instinctual responses mixed with individual experience. So in terms of both hive decisions and individual decisions, I think it is a mix of hardwired responses, but also dependent on the individual bee's experiences.
Okay. And I just had another question as well. Do you know if anyone sort of looked at the difference of, between the brain of the female versus the male?
There has been. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there are also behavioral studies on, for example, whether male bees can learn colors as fast as worker bees. I think I remember that they could learn just as fast, but in terms of the actual brain structure, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, a lot of people have actually looked into that question.
Okay, thank you.